All right, thank you everyone. So I have to start off by apologizing. I woke up with a bit of a cold this morning, so if I sound hoarse or a little tired, that's why. April was crazy for me. I was home for like 5 days. Oh, yes, a clicker. Are you trying to sabotage me? So I'm going to try to do something. So today we've heard a lot of really interesting speakers. We've heard people talk about really interesting topics. We've heard people talk about their careers. We've really heard a combination of advice. And hey, let's learn about something cool. And I'm going to try, see how successful I am, to do both today. Because I, like many people, have a somewhat unconventional career that actually did not start in space at all. But that isn't because I wasn't a space geek. So as a kid, I tried to go to space camp when I was in second grade instead of the fourth grade. I had a whole collection of memorabilia. I read all the books, did all this stuff. But when I was 16 and I had to decide where to apply for college, I was just aware enough of myself that I realized, well, I can't be a pilot because my eyesight's crap. I don't want to be a scientist because even though I love what science does for the world, I don't really enjoy repeating the same experiments over and over again. My science chemistry class taught me that one. And physics, oh God, physics. And I realized that I was definitely not cut out to be an engineer for a lot of the same reasons. And so I was like, well, guess that leaves being an astronaut. And I was like, I don't really think my chances of being an astronaut are really high. So I decided, okay, I'm going to do this other thing that I love. And for me, that was international relations and politics and things like that. So I came to DC, I went to Georgetown, studied international relations, and then I pursued a career completely unrelated to science and space at all. So I worked in international development, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, for a number of years. So I worked in East Africa, including what is now South Sudan. I worked in Afghanistan, Somalia, Tanzania, a variety of places, doing political work. So we'll get to the definitions in a minute, but the basic idea is, like, you've heard of humanitarian disaster response. Well, there's a whole industry that kind of surrounds doing work like that in other countries, and that's what I did for a number of years. And then I decided, I want to move back home. I love what I do, but I don't really want to run a DC office and write project proposals and reports all the time, so what am I going to do instead? And I talked to some friends and I said, oh, there's actually space people in DC. Maybe I could switch into space, which I still loved and still followed and still did all these things. And I said, maybe I can take these project management skills and all these other things and convince somebody to give me a job, which I did. Thanks, Carissa. I don't know if Mike French is still in the room, but had a great time at Bryce for a number of years and at NASA. And that's what I did. And so I've been building a career. It's been a long time since I've made this switch. So it's a lot of fun. But it's a bit unconventional. And then something really cool happened in 2015. In 2015, the world agreed, most of the world, agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals that try to capture what needs to be done in the world, what are the targets that we should try to hit by 2030. And all these countries signed an agreement at the UN, and they said, hey, we're going to work towards these goals. Now, how many people have ever heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Wow, okay, wonderful. So I'm going to adjust. I wanted an account because I can start really basic, like what is all this stuff, or I can kind of take it up a level and talk about really where I think it intersects with space. But in that document, the initial document that was signed, it specifically references geospatial information as one of the key technologies that are going to be used in achieving these goals. And so for me, it was like the two worlds that I really didn't think have anything to do. I kind of pulled a fast one when I was talking about how transferable my skills were. Kind of came back together. And now I actually get to do both of these things. For me, that's super exciting. It's not something that always happens, but in this case, it did. So first thing is, if you're interested in this topic, at the end of it, there's a ton of resources out there. A lot has been written about how space, geospatial communication satellites, trust me, I lived by VSAT, live or die by VSAT when you live in Afghanistan, has really been written about this. What I want to try to do today is set the stage for why is this an important topic? How does it affect your life, depending on whether you're in the government or you're at a small startup or you're a large company? Why does this topic matter? Why does sustainable development, which is kind of becoming a catchword in a lot of places, what does that have to do with you? And then also just kind of go over what are some unique examples? Because I think we tend to be like, oh yeah, of course, being able to look from space is really helpful when we talk about agriculture, which is true. But there's actually a ton of things that you can do that you might not think of. So again, these are the symbols for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, they range from everything from poverty and hunger to jobs, to life on land, life under the water, to climate change, to infrastructure, you name it, it's in there. One thing that I like to say about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they are not new problems. It's not like the world sat down and we said, hey, we finally figured out what the issues are, and we've written them down. That's not the case here. What these were is a framework to say, okay, we have people working across all of these different fields, and they don't have all of the resources or the technologies that they need to really make an improvement in all of these areas. And we also need a commitment to actually make progress here. So these are more of a framework for how to discuss things, how to monitor and measure progress towards a huge number of goals. One thing that I like to talk about is the international development industry, because I think that this is something that's often overlooked. We get excited. We talk about remote sensing for refugees. We talk about nightlight studies on the Syrian war. We talk about illegal trafficking. We talk about elephants. We can talk about all these really cool case studies, and they're amazing, and I'm going to talk about some too. But what I thought could be interesting is to hear more from an international development professional. So back in 2009, I was on the ground in Afghanistan. I was a monitoring and evaluation manager, and it was my job to check on what projects were happening, to make sure they were happening, and to report that progress both internally in the country to the military, to the Afghan government, and then back to the funders in the United States and other countries. That was at least my first job anyway. Now, if you might imagine, 2009, Afghanistan is not always the safest place. And seeing as how I wasn't actually a military professional, though we worked quite closely with local forces, military, and local communities, there were a lot of places I couldn't go. And in some cases, there were places where I couldn't even get my staff to go. And I was perfectly aware that there was technology out there that would help me done my job better. But we didn't really use it. It wasn't so much because now looking back with a much better understanding of how remote sensing works, what's available, and how one might get it, now I kind of know what I needed to know, but then I didn't. And the people around me didn't really either. And so one of the things I like to talk about, I see it as a challenge, but I see it as a positive challenge, is that we in the space industry have an opportunity. And we get excited about doing this, whether it's pro bono, whether it's part of a business plan, whatever your way of interacting with it is depending on your job. These projects can be really exciting. Whatever issue you might be passionate about, there's probably a way that space can help. It's one of the most exciting things about the data, especially that comes from space, is that it's relatively unbiased, it's generally global, we're seeing lots of new technological innovations, and that means the opportunities to apply it in terms of projects and helping around the globe is essentially exponential. If you think of a project, and I'm going to go over a couple of really kind of out there ones in a minute, you can probably find a way where your decision making can be improved using data and analysis that comes from space. But how do you actually get that operationalized? And so one thing that I like to say for people who are, for instance, in business, if you're trying to sell a widget or a sensor or a satellite or whatever it is you're trying to sell, you don't go into a client and assume that, hey, they love what you have as much as you do. You go in and you say, hey, I've got this really cool thing. Let me teach you about it. Let me talk to you. Let me work with you. You don't assume everybody knows what they need, right? When you assume the client knows what they need, you're probably not going to make a sell, because if they knew that, they'd just come and purchase it and you'd be done and you wouldn't have anything to sell. It's the same thing with international development, with how space can contribute to goals. Is we have to learn to interface with the industry that exists, with national governments around the world, with civil society, and with aid organizations. So I have a list here, if you're interested later, all the different stakeholders. It's myriad. But it also gives us a lot of opportunities in the space world to interact. These are just some interesting questions that I like to bring up, some of which I've kind of already touched on a little bit. But the biggest one is that a lot of end users are simply unaware of the opportunities. And I really think that's the first step. There's lots of good information out there, don't get me wrong. But I've done some experiments where I Google things like Earth observation and land degradation, or Earth observer remote sensing and this. It's very interesting what you get back. Sometimes it's very helpful, but a lot of times it's not. And so what are the pathways for creating linkages between our industries and other industries that can lead to the adoption of space data? These are just some points that I like to make about why this imagery is generally remote sensing, but also we also tend to ignore communications infrastructure, which is just as important. None of this comes as a huge surprise, but it is important to understand that this is a unique data set. It's different than other kinds of data sets, and it's particularly valuable for efforts around those Sustainable Development Goals, which are often conducted in very remote places, places that are hard to access, and places with severe weather. There's a lot of challenges generally in that kind of work, and this is the kind of data that is very poised and very appropriate to assist. So 3 projects, just to highlight kind of some of what you can do. One is mapping. So this is a relatively famous project in Tanzania, the Dar Hurumi project. You can find lots of information about it online. It's a consortium of a bunch of people. They've taught students, they've taught nurses, they've taught all sorts of different groups of people to go around and to map slums, mostly around Dar es Salaam, in order to improve projects with the government and with other aid organizations. It's a bit hard to see on this particular map, but the difference in the map before and the map after, especially in terms of public services and actual infrastructure beyond just is there a road or isn't there a road, were really improved. None of that could be done without space information. Applying digital change techniques to small-scale projects. I like to point this one out because we tend to think of agriculture on a really big scale, but it's actually just as useful for small-scale projects. So they've used this for mapping illegal charcoal production in Somalia, which I think most of you have heard of because of the pirates, but there's a lot more to Somalia than pirates. And then using NDVI for assessing projects in rural Tanzania as well. So the idea is that small charities, if they have the opportunity, go out, they do work. A lot of times it has to do with trees, we're working with different farmers to plant different crops. Those projects need to be assessed just like everything else. And if you can have access to the right kinds of data, in this case, much of which is free, you can do that. And then finally, democracy and governance. If I told you that you could use space data at every stage of an elections monitoring program, would you believe me? From the very beginning, where you design the project, to figuring out where the polling stations go, from day of detection to tell you how many people actually showed up, because in a lot of places voting takes place outside, all the way through to confidence building measures afterwards to hopefully show the election was done in a free and fair manner. And since I'm almost out of time, these are some really interesting maps on that topic. You can also do fire mapping if there is a problem. So in Kenya in 2008, they used satellite imagery to track violence following a presidential election that was contested. And then finally, some information about my organization. The one thing I wanted to point out to everyone also, we are having a summit on space sustainability. So if this topic or other topics that we work on is of interest to you, let me know. I'm happy to get student discount rates. We also have a number of free resources online. So if those things are of interest to you, I didn't talk about them much today, but I'm happy to do that. And also, Clay was up here and he reminded me, we also have scholarships for the IAC coming up in the fall. So if that is of interest to you and you have a paper that's been selected, let us know and we take that will be opening within about a week. All right, thank you.